Well, hello, thank you. This is my first time to your space, it's more than a studio. It's a maker space, it's an office, there's neighborhoods. I love it. And the sun is coming through, so thank you for having me. Every now and then this is gonna pop up because I couldn't figure out how to get that off, but okay. So thank you for the wonderful introduction. I actually went through a bit of a similar program because not only do I teach in the in the Masters of Design program, Design as Entrepreneur, but I am also a client because I went to it. I graduated, I was there in 2001 to 2003. And I think it was the third class. And so, it was definitely something that I enjoyed, and it's influenced me from that point on. And hopefully some of the things that I learned now get executed in what I do on a daily basis. So anyway, this is a presentation I put together for you all that shows a little bit about what I do, what we do. And I put it together in a way that hopefully will be somewhat interactive, and also in a way that I think can help you think about problems, and maybe some of those problems you can think about and start to see how we've addressed them. And so the basic presentation setup is like this. You have some questions, and I'm going to go through and answer them. So I'll start it off by asking this question: who is OCD? And it may be a little bit of the answer can build on what Alan has already started to set up, which is the name. 6 years ago, we started this branding company. It's a branding and design agency. We started it, myself and Jennifer Kynan, who we met in the graduate program. We sat right next to each other. Alan was just talking about how you all have this great setup of constantly changing and being able to interact with each other in new setups, sitting arrangements. Well, in my program, we sat next to the same person each year. And the good part about that is that's how Jennifer and I began to talk to one another, as well as that's how we got to know each other, because I started asking her to give me feedback on things that I was working on as a student, and she was not shy in giving me that feedback. And so her being honest really helped me to do my best work as a student, and luckily I was able to return the favor. We love that brutal honesty so much that several years later, after working at a handful of different places, we started our own company together. And that same relationship still continues to work and helps us to hopefully thrive day to day. Actually, we just took this picture a couple of, maybe last week, 2 weeks ago. We celebrated our 6th birthday, and we were sent balloons, and those balloons obviously say OCD. The name was very deliberate, because everything that we do as a company, as designers, is deliberate. We're thinking about them, we're very methodical, and we are approaching things in a way that's going to help us to stand out, and also help people to understand what they're participating in. So with a name like the original Champions of Design, it's very much about being champions of design and the process. And then with the acronym of OCD, sometimes I think we say to our clients who ask the same thing, is you kind of want all of your designers to be a little OCD. And that goes into us being very meticulous, attention to detail, being somewhat repetitive, and making sure that the point is made and is gotten across, as well as one of the most important parts, and I don't know if this has anything to do with the name, but we have to listen. We have to do a lot of listening in order for us to be successful. Our office is in the East Village, so that's where we're standing in front of our office, which is a storefront. This is the team. Jennifer Kynan in the middle, next to me on the right. This was a picture taken a couple of years ago, right before she went to run the New York City Marathon. And so we designed these shirts for her and had a big send-off. And we also have a dog in the office, Jennifer's dog named Joby. She's a 100-pound Greater Swiss Mountain dog who we all love and sometimes have to take care of. She has this thing of coming up to your computer and kind of demanding attention. And so your mouse hand, you have to end up petting her with it, and she won't stop until she's satisfied. So it kind of, in some ways, it's designed to force a break from us just staring at the computer all the time. So we have Joby to thank for that. And this is what we do. This is what, for us, Jennifer and I, we get really excited about developing brand identity systems. And for us, a major component of that brand identity system is the logo. And so these are some of the logos that we have developed. And they vary from the WNBA to the Girl Scouts and Highline Art, and then some that are maybe less known, but all are companies that we have had the pleasure of working with, and also companies that are doing things that we really believe in, that we support, and that we are excited to work with every day. So, what I'm going to walk you through today are some case studies in branding. And if this works, great. So that brings us back here. Now, what I've done is I've put together a handful of these questions, and at the conclusion of each case study, some are longer, some are shorter, we can go back, and each one, hopefully, in me talking about the work, addresses the questions that we have here. So why don't I start by getting someone here to ask one of the questions, and that's how we'll decide where we'll go. Don't be shy.
What is a brand?
Well, all right. So we'll start there. It's obvious, first one. So, okay. So a brand is, in some ways, this is from Marty Neumeier. A brand is a person's gut feeling about a product, a service, or an organization. Does that answer your question? So let me elaborate. So if we look at newspapers, and you look at all of these front page newspapers, some are very familiar to you. And if we think about that gut feeling, that thing that we want people to respond to, what helps you stand out, what qualities that you have, each one of these newspapers has its own personality, and it has its own character. Now, to kind of further explain what we're talking about, like, we can start to narrow this down. So there's some up here that are probably a bit more honest and straightforward than others. So we can start to then focus it and narrow it down a little bit. Diversity, the diversity of the information, the diversity of the staff, the diversity of the people that they are featuring, then we start to narrow them down even more. Global, some are very local, regional newspapers, and then others are much bigger, and they're also reporting on things that are happening in various parts of the world with different points of view. Now, the reason I'm showing you this is because these all are newspapers, but they all have some brand components that we may or may not be familiar with. Which ones are current? Which ones are relevant? Which ones are just repeating information that was produced by some other entity? And as we start to focus it, you start to see that there's less and less. And as these elements come together, you start to have some that stand out. So for instance, if we focus on this one, which you're very familiar with, the New York Times, we could say, and this would be argued, honest, diverse, global, it's relevant, time-honored tradition. And those things are part of what makes the New York Times, and that has been established from them delivering on these elements for a long time, over a long period of time. So if we take today's paper, for instance, this is the front of the New York Times today. It was a big week this week, and a big election yesterday. I forgot to mention one thing that I'll mention after this, but if we look at this, the reason I wanted to show you this is because when you start to see the New York Times and those characteristics that I highlighted, then that's when you're reading this, you start to get the sense that you're reading a paper that brings a certain gravitas and legitimacy to the stories it's reporting. But it also affects the person who is engaging in reading this newspaper. If you're on the subway, you see somebody reading the New York Post and you see somebody else reading the New York Times, do you, and maybe you shouldn't, but do you think about them differently? Do you think one is more serious while the other is more lighthearted? Now, what the New York Times has been able to do is they have learned that they have established a brand. They've established a connection with their audience, and they want to continue to establish that. And so they're thinking every day about what they can do and how they leverage those qualities of the brand. And they do that because, as we know, in newspapers, back in the day, that was the main source of gaining your content. But now you can go online, you have apps, you have other products. And so the newspaper isn't quite the same as it always has been. So that means the New York Times has to live on desktop, mobile, in their magazine. They're starting to crunch the content and develop features in new and different ways. Whether when you drive past or walk past the building, and how even the signage is displayed and developed to be displayed on that building, and what happens in that building, they all go back to the story that they are continuing to tell, the standard that they are continuing to set, and it allows them to continue to use that logo and some of those other characteristics across other pieces. So if they're selling a hat to someone, then that someone is not buying a hat. For them, they're buying into a credo. They're buying into a little bit of the feeling of being part of something much bigger. They're buying into, if I wear this hat, then I'm seen as an honest, a trustworthy, relevant person, and I can talk to people about it, and they respond to me, and it makes me smarter. They're buying into something there, and whether they're doing it deliberately, whether the New York Times is selling things to have that effect, probably not necessarily, but the brand and what happens with the New York Times affects all of these other pieces. Now, why am I showing you that? We do a decent amount of work with the New York Times, and I'll show you one of the projects here that we get really excited about, and it starts here. This is at the beginning. This is 1855, is one of, if not the very first front page of the New York Times. And when we work on these brand identity projects, especially for companies that have been around for a long time, we want to make sure that we know how people have been engaging with that company, how they've been engaging with the brand, and what story, what narrative is being told. So when we were asked by the New York Times Magazine to help them establish a kind of casual, more informal identity for their magazine as they went through their most recent redesign, they wanted something that would help them kind of signify the voice of the magazine across social media and across other digital applications. So across apps and phones and podcasts. And so we said, sure, we'd love to do that. The team there is fantastic. The work they're doing is really pretty groundbreaking. And in order for us to do that, we had to understand who the New York Times is. And even more so, who they were. So going back to the first, even looking at this visual legacy that they've established, this is one of the newspapers from, I think it was right after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. And this was their way of paying tribute to Lincoln by making the gutters of the columns of text black. So that was their tribute to Lincoln. And then how does that and the New York Times then impact the magazine? If you go back to some of the original magazine covers, here for instance, you know that you have that typeface, that beautiful, distinguished New York Times black letter typeface. Then the magazine is written in the same letters. That's applied across the covers. Then some color is introduced, full bleed imagery, and that logo gets a little bit smaller. Their first color photograph on the cover. And this is in the 60s, I think 64. But that logo, that masthead at the very top actually remains quite consistent. Then you can tell we start to get into the 70s. How does the brand evolve? How does the identity evolve over time? They start to introduce some typefaces, some bolder use of type. There's still the content that they're featuring is still very relevant. And then up and through the 90s and the aughts, the 2000 to 2010, how they've become much more of a lifestyle magazine. They've learned in the process that they don't have the same issue of needing to sell magazines on the newsstands, so they're able to get away with a bit more conceptual covers, which then helps them to stand out from competitors because they can approach the subject matter in new and interesting ways. Now, when we started working with them, these were two of the groundbreaking covers that had just been developed. One where they kind of messed up the cover by doing a lot of photocopying of, I think that's Rand Paul, as well as one of the most greatest impact covers there on the left, where the whole magazine, they took the logo, they put it on the side, and they made it feel like something that you were receiving in the mail. So when we had to develop a mark, an identity element that they could use across these different platforms, this was the logo that we were working with, and we knew we couldn't really do too much with it because they had been around for so long. If we came back to them with something that was too different, then people wouldn't trust us. It wouldn't have the same connection to the brand that they needed for people to really believe in it. And when you go online, the other challenge that we have now that we didn't have 15 years ago was everything's small. So back in the day when I was in college, we had to design logos that worked big and small, and we'd be very careful about when it gets small, how that worked. But then, 5, 10 years later, you didn't really deal with that issue anymore because there wasn't a lot of using the logo small. Like you could make it bigger, you could do a lot more with it, desktop publishing. But now we're back to app buttons and social media headers and avatars, and we have to think about abbreviations and shorthands again. And so when you have the New York Times Magazine, how do you put that in the header of a Twitter icon? So what we were able to do is we knew that they have the magazine that they're going to get in their hands every day, that every Sunday you're going to get that magazine in your hands. But how do we break that down in a way that you consume content daily? Well, we wanted to make it a little bit more informal. And so we simply used the same typeface. It was redrawn a little bit. And then we presented them with a lowercase version of the New York Times Magazine. So in some ways you have your, my name is Bobby Cole Martin Jr., but my friends call me Marty. And so I have my nickname. When you're talking to me online and back and forth and we're sharing comments and having conversations, then you can just call me by my shorthand. You can call me by my nickname, which is then still New York Times Magazine, but visually it's a nickname. And that can be applied across Twitter, across podcasts, The Ethicists and Talk, as well as other applications. So now across their social media, when they are featuring stories, so for instance, this is from the past weekend with their music issue, they can change their typeface when they're speaking to specific features, but that simple, very easy to recognize lowercase NYT mag is there at the top or even there on the left as these tiles get featured throughout Twitter and Instagram and other applications. And also at South by Southwest and other events where you normally would have the New York Times Magazine written out and it becomes a bit unwieldy, you're able to use this more like a logo. You don't have to worry about messing it up too much because it's the more informal gesture for the magazine. So we were able to take the qualities that we learned from the history of the New York Times, make sure that we kept a lot of the integrity of the New York Times, but we were able to use the skeleton, the structure, the infrastructure of the type of that story and bring it back through the magazine across other applications so that it told a similar story but allowed for some variation. And that was something we were only able to do after understanding the brand itself. What other question? Where can I go next? Yes?
Who are green bloods?
All right, good one. Okay, so who are green bloods? Any guesses? So, it brings us here. I've given away the who they are, but the Girl Scouts of the USA asked us to help them build an identity system. And the reason being is because they had this beautiful logo that was developed in 1978 by a very iconic and famous graphic designer named Saul Bass. And in 1978, you had very different challenges that you have 30 years later. 30 years later, you're faced with desktop publishing, you're faced with internet and social media, and the identity system starts to become a little bit less cohesive, completely less consistent, and they needed some secondary parts in their greater toolkit to help them speak to the girls of the Girl Scouts. Now, the question was, who are the green bloods? Anybody, such as the New York Times, if you are a New York Times reader, and you've been a New York Times reader for as far back as you can remember, you believe in the New York Times. For the Girl Scouts, for women who grew up and they were Girl Scouts, their mother was a Girl Scout, their grandmother might have been a Girl Scout, and now they're in their 40s and 50s and 60s, and they are giving back, they're volunteering, they're troop leaders. They care so much about who the Girl Scouts are that Girl Scout green is pumping through their veins, and they are actually known as green bloods. So anytime we work with a company that has built a lot of equity over a long period of time, we need to speak to who's most important, the audience, and who have been engaged with that brand over a long period of time. So we had to actually talk to these green bloods because we had to know what they cared about if we were going to develop a system for the Girl Scouts. So this is what the Girl Scouts looked like when we started working with them. And one of the things that's actually missing from this is the green. There's very little green in the Girl Scouts materials. And so the green bloods, if we did anything, we had to make sure that it went back to the core of what they knew the Girl Scouts to be. Now, the way we did that, almost similar to the New York Times, but the Girl Scouts has an actual archive, probably as big as this room, full of like, there's cabinets, there's dressers, there's hangers, there's tons and tons of materials, and they go back to 100 years. And what we learned after looking at and taking pictures of all of these materials is they had one symbol that in one way or another was used for the Girl Scouts over that long period of time. And that is this symbol that you see here. It's actually called a trefoil. And that's a three-leafed icon. It comes out of kind of military iconography. It comes out of camping. And back in the day when they started, they were much more based around camping. They were much more based around, in some ways, following what the Boy Scouts did, and then teaching girls what they, how to be a good wife and that type of thing. But that changed in the 60s and 70s with women's lib, where women were becoming much more front and center. So instead of taking a back seat, they were now starting to say, hey, let's take women seriously, equal pay, equal jobs, bring it on. And so Saul Bass was able to use this trefoil-like shape, brilliantly redraw it, soften it a little bit, make it a bit more symmetrical, and bring the girls and the ladies into the mark. And so that was really inspired by the movements and the things that were happening contextually at the time. What we needed to do is go back to the beginning in order for us to go forward into the future. And we did that by first learning that that trefoil is very important. Now, if we learn that that's important, then we can evolve that identity by keeping the integrity of the mark that Saul Bass had developed, keeping the girls front and center. We tweaked some of we redrew the faces. We gave them a little bang to help differentiate the different silhouettes of the ladies in the shape, but they're the same, but giving them the bang actually implied diversity a little bit more. We tweaked the nose, giving them a little bit more strength to the lips, and then the neckline becomes much stronger. It's much more of a bold, confident sash, similar to the Girl Scout sash, and that enabled us to develop a distinguishable, distinctive mark led by that symbol, almost like a ship going through the water. You have this leadership symbol. You have this proud symbol that they could use to be the nucleus of a much bigger system. That much bigger system had to work across all of the different regions. There's hundreds of these. And so all of them start with Girl Scouts at the beginning and then one for each region. And then some of you are quite familiar with their grade levels. So the grade levels here from the daisies, the brownies, on to the ambassadors. They get their own color, and then that Girl Scout service mark is what it's called, is there leading the way. Instead of asking girls to join the Girl Scouts, we more confidently encourage them to just be themselves by being a girl and using a distinctive typeface that picked up on that trefoil shape. We were able to be a bit more expressive. Now, one of the big differences here is we made that change to the mark that allowed us to also give them a shape that was quite unique. So now with this shape, if it doesn't have the full faces in it, then you have the shape where you can bring type. You can use that to hold type or to tell bigger stories like pattern, and it works beautifully online and across other applications. So in the end, we had to make sure for those who had been part of the Girl Scouts for over 100 years that we were true to who they were, and we were able to embody a lot of those characteristics, but move them forward by giving them a simple yet fairly flexible system that they could use to develop the work. And this is something we call the Girl Scouts cheat sheet, which is 8 key questions to ask yourself when you're developing a Girl Scout branded piece. This is brand identity in a nutshell for all of those outside of the marketing and the design department, the people like the Green Bloods that are making things for car washes and bake sales, that are raising money, that are like Chris Rock that's out there at the Oscars trying to sell cookies. This could go to him so that when he's working with his daughter, he's making sure that things feel like what the Girl Scouts should feel like. I was so impressed with now, 6, 7 years later, after this is rolling out, when Chris Rock sold those Girl Scout cookies at the Oscars, they used the brand typeface to be able to tell that story. It was completely on brand, and it was so exhilarating to see that as someone who helped to establish that system. So this was something that goes back to the core of who they were, figuring out who they were in order to help them move forward. This was the first, and maybe the only, project we've ever worked on where we've been minted by the US Mint. So not only do you have the Girl Scout logo there on your left, but then we did the anniversary, their 100th anniversary mark, which is underneath the girls there on the right. So maybe I'll pick the next one because I think it might be quite relevant for some of what you do, and it's a pretty long one. And then we'll go from there. Let's see if this works this time. Great, that time it worked. So in my past, recent past, I worked in London at a company that some of you may know called Nokia. And while I was there was tons of things that I learned about branding. And I wanted to work there so that I could understand branding and identity design on a macro level, so I could understand how it works across the whole world. When I first started, this is what Nokia looked like, because they were selling, based on research, based on a lot of them talking to people all across the world, they learned that not everybody wanted the exact same phone. Not everybody wanted the exact same device. And my mom would want something different than my sister. And so they developed the phones in that way, based on that research. based on the understanding of who these consumers, who the people that were buying it were. But they also started to package the phones differently to be able to send off those different signals. Now, in theory, that would work really well, but for a company the size of Nokia, what started to happen is it diluted the brand. So when I would talk to a lot of people about this, I would say, well, where is the Nokia? Can you point out the Nokia product here? They all are Nokia, but they all say Nokia in a completely different way. So part of what we had to do is figure out how to enhance that brand so that it would make the products stand out across the shelves and in the eyes of the people that were buying these devices all over the world. Now, this is actually how it looked online in retail. And so this is next to, there's BlackBerry, there's Nokia, there's a lot of other products. And so when you are faced with this choice and you haven't done research and you're trying to figure out what you want, what are the things that are helping you to make a decision? And if you are a company trying to sell these devices, and a lot of people very much respected and loved Nokia, but if you can't even locate the Nokia products, it was a bit of a challenge. So what we did is, once again, we did our research. We do a lot of research, whether it's diving in archives when they have archives, whether it's one of my favorite places to do research online is like going to eBay and just seeing what I can find from random stuff that some diehard, some green blood is selling, you know, and there's some gems that you can find. What we had to do is we had to go in search of Nokia. We had to try to find out who Nokia was, what the story is that they were telling. Like this, for instance, I think this is a shot from, they used to have a brick and mortar shop on 57th Street, right here, 57th in between, I think it's 5th and Madison. And it's pretty sleek. It was a beautiful, a little cold. There was some warmth in the back, but a little bit of a cold experience. But the thing out of all of these that stood out was Nokia it had a color, it had a feeling, and that wasn't really communicated clearly when in the actual products. And so what we did is we were able to say, okay, if we take a step back and we really try to find out who Nokia is and what they look like, why don't we start with infusing the products with color? So if we bring the product to the front, we bring the name, and then we just, instead of having a completely different pattern and color for every single product, we would go with finding this color blocking approach of the Nokia blue and applying that to all of the Nokia packaging as well as other things that kind of surrounded and ancillary items. So our proposal was to use what we called Indigo, the Project Indigo, where we would take the differentiated products and we bring them into a branded approach. So we're not needing to have the products do all of the work in selling themselves. Instead, we let what people love the most, which is they love the brand in a lot of ways. And so let's bring the brand a bit more front and center. Now, in doing that, we had to do a lot of testing. And when we tested it, the cool part about working for a big brand is we were able to actually make these packages and put them out there in the world in reality. So it wasn't like I'm doing a lot of times now when in the office and comping things. We definitely did a lot of that, but we went through full production to get these products out there and test them. So we had to get the color right. We had teams going all over the world, going to different plants. This is some of the team to build out to test the color. We had to also, we made some tweaks to the actual box structure. We changed the material. They're a super sustainable company as big as they are. They were so concerned about sustainability. And so, but the culture of the company, being a Finnish company, they didn't like to brag about the things that they were doing. And so we wanted to make sure that we were able, through branding, through packaging, and through other kind of tactile qualities, that we could tell the story about how the sustainable measures and requirements that they put themselves through. So we moved, it's one of the only product packages, especially at that scale, where we used an uncoated paper stock, a highly sustainable, I think it was recycled paper, for all the packaging. And then we brought in one color tab to be able to help you distinguish more than the name and the product on itself, which, those categories. So before, when every single package had a completely different color, completely different size, a completely different pattern, we've really, we simplified that in order to help them stand out in the retail environment. The naming at the same time was also being developed, so that was something that we were working on. And then we came up with a new approach for art direction of the imagery. And so the images went from actually being photographed to being full on these really beautiful detailed renders, these high-res renders, for various reasons that we'll get into another time. And then one of the big questions that would come back from the program, sounds like something off of the 1984, the program, which is each device had its own unit. And so how do you distinguish the really high-end devices, the ones that you're paying $100, $200, $400 for, versus the lower-end ones? And so we were able to not, which is the default, the lazy way of doing it, just making everything black, which is what a lot of times we'll say, oh, just make it black, that says high-end. Instead, we stuck with that Nokia blue, but we introduced different finishes, different tactile qualities to help to signify these more high-end devices. And this is a funny thing. This is just a simple, basically like a UPC code. And it was this big chunky thing that was about 2-3 inches high, 2-3 inches wide, that was on the back of every package. The funniest thing about it, and this is real, is because that label, there was this big white label, it was this big, they couldn't change that label. So because they couldn't change the size of that label, they couldn't make the actual packages smaller. So the packages had to be a certain size because the label that they used was a certain size. Mind-blowing. So I had one of my designers spend 2 years talking to everybody across the whole world about how all the different manufacturers, all the different people, how can we make this label smaller? And then we weren't happy and content with just making it smaller. Then, because we still have this big white label on everything, so then we wanted to match the color of the packages too. So this simple little stupid label caused a lot of heartaches for everybody, but we finally were able to make it smaller after it literally took us almost 2 years. So with that, we were able to do a pretty extensive new approach of identity across packaging to help Nokia stand out in retail. Now, the next question that I'll ask here is then, how do we know it works? And so, as I mentioned, we went through this whole process to test it. And so after going through that process and coming up with blue, it's just, oh, some designers with some strategy and we make this blue package. Well, it doesn't always work like that. We have to sell it in. We have to sell it up to a lot of guys that are in this long boardroom, and we have to go around and you have to support that with some actual research. And so we had to get out there in front of people and test it. So what we were able to do is go across different places, different key markets. One was Dubai, where we actually, in Dubai, we went there, and not in the kind of big, shiny, glitzy Dubai that you all see on television. Like, this is like the real Dubai. And like, you go into these shops and they just have wall-to-wall products and boxes so that you can, that's how you actually saw the product. It wasn't the type of thing where you go into like a T-Mobile store here and you're able to touch the phone and play with it and call home. Like, this was a thing where everything was there and you just picked what you wanted. So this is actually shot in one of those shops where this is what the current day situation looked like. So they had the Nokia connecting people there at the top, but the products, if you had to quickly say, where's the Nokia product, you weren't quite sure where it was. And then once we went through this process and replaced those packages with the new one, you knew very clearly where to find the Nokia products. And this, obviously, yes, this is when we're putting them all into one of the cases and having them there together. But even amongst the competitors, if you put one of those boxes in there, it completely stood out from all of the white and black boxes that everybody else was using. We didn't just do that for the phone devices, we did it for all of the accessories. We went to Madrid and did the exact same thing. This was a bit more traditional, what you would think of as traditional retail with the devices there, but we were able to use the packages in the back for color blocking to help draw people into the shop-in-shop experience. In Mumbai, similar to Dubai, where you walk into these places and it's just packed wall to wall with different boxes of, and what the other thing is, all of the guys, they learned what this product could do by reading the box, by looking at the box. And so those were things we were able to, once we learned that, once we were able to ask them questions and learn that, we could make so many changes that were just, had been there, they had been kind of grandfathered in and nobody tested them. So afterwards, in Mumbai, this is what the shop looked like. So in the end, Nokia went from being a company that sold every product differently, and when you have hundreds of products, hundreds and hundreds of products, and then when you start to get products that are, have different versions of them, it's just so many more, and selling each one individually, which got pretty complex, we were able to simplify the graphic approach, the identity across the packaging, to then put the Nokia brand more front and center. You can see how that, and you know, some of the other things we learned during the way, which you can quickly see here, but we learned that a lot of times the people in the retail would learn what a device could do, not by reading about it, but simply by looking at the screen and seeing what features it had. So we were able to use and take a lot of the language off of the back of the packages to, and just basically put more images that pointed to the different features. Okay. So,
can design start a movement?
Yay.
Okay. All right. So one of the interesting things about can design start a movement, movement can be a lot of different things. I think now when we see what's happening in the political landscape, there's like the, kind of a political movement. Here, when in New York City, one of the things that's quite interesting with music is that people are always trying different things. You have new music, new genres, and then you have those that have been around for a while, and they start to get a little old and dusty. And so I worked as the design director at Jazzy Center. And one of the interesting things about it is when working there, we moved into the building over the TimeWarner Center. And the first thing you think about when you have to tell people about jazz, the first thing you think about is Miles Davis. The second thing you think about is John Coltrane. And the third thing you think about is Blue Note albums. So the Blue Note record label had these beautiful albums that were developed by a guy named Reed Miles back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And that's all kind of this graphic overtone of images that have been manipulated. And what we needed to do is figure out, how do you stand out from that? How do you help people to get excited about a somewhat old music form? I mean, now jazz compared to classical music is so much younger. But compared to hip hop and compared to EDM and other things, it's old and dusty. So starting to think about when jazz is at its very best, it's killing. So we came up with this approach to, when jazz is killing, love falls deeper. When jazz is killing, voices scream louder. Passions burn hotter. When jazz is killing, sounds charm, cocktails tease, and people play. And what we needed to do this because in New York City, nobody cared about jazz. Nobody went and you could go to Village Vanguard, you could go to all of these different jazz clubs, and you could go see old and dusty jazz, Or you hear it when you're in the elevator. Nobody cared about jazz. So why do you continue to position jazz in the way that everybody has seen over the time and they're bored with? So we needed to put butts in seats. We needed to sell tickets to people in New York City that could go to Broadway, they could go to a Knicks game, they could do so much more. They could just sit in Central Park. Why would I pay $120 to go see somebody play jazz in this formal environment up in Columbus Circle? So what we needed to do is turn the jazz approach on its head and cut through a lot of the clutter. So the way we started the movement here is by infusing all of the communications with a much more potent, direct, especially for Lincoln Center, a little bit more edgy approach to how we're speaking to people who we want to come to these events. All of the materials reflected that this is not going to be something where you're going to go to sleep sitting in, you're in the elevator and you're kind of nodding off. This was going to be an exciting, rump-shaking, a little bit risque environment. And whether it's with the full season, which was there on your left, or if Willie Nelson comes to, like having him kind of break through a little bit of tension in our imagery. And then the big thing here was almost like Nokia, where we had to break through with, when everybody was using white and black packaging, we were going with the blue. For Jazz at Lincoln Center, this was a bright fluorescent day glow pink. It was so pink, in fact, and so bright that when we did it, we printed everything in this fluorescent color, and we got all this is like thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of dollars go into all this printing. And they got it back, and I don't think anybody other than me really realized how pink this was going to be. And it's bright and fluorescent, and they were like, "Whoa!" I get the email saying, "Can you come to my office, please?" And so being able to then send this out to all of the different people that we wanted to come to the jazz events and pay tickets and subscribe, this helped them to pay attention a little bit more. So, whether it's, the guy on your left is Ted Nash, who's this incredible saxophone player for the Jazz at Lincoln Center Orchestra, but he looks like it's 1940 out there, and that's a cigarette, but it's not. It's just his reed from his saxophone and and even that was a little risque for them. But it's like, oh, why is that in his mouth? Cecil Taylor, which if you listen to Cecil Taylor, it's the craziest shit you've ever heard. But this, one of our designers took this picture in the subway, like one day on the way to the office, and we loved it because that's what the music felt like. And then we used the type to reflect that also, some scale with the Cecil Taylor, the little ampersand, John Zorn. So when you go to that concert, you know what you're going to expect. And a lot of times, like, how many people in here know who Cecil Taylor is? One person. But I got to get all of you to go to this concert. So if you see that, I don't know what that's going to be, but I'll go check it out. I don't know if I'll pay $120, but I'll go check it out. And I just wanted people to pay attention to it. And so we needed to do some of these things to be able to stand out from all of the other competing things that were competing for eyes and attention and dollars in New York City. There was an interesting story that I used to tell about this, especially when I was selling it in, because it took a lot of selling in, was if you take a blue van for, say, a laundry, a dry cleaner, and it's driving all around New York City, once it leaves, it's gone, you don't see it. But if you take that same dry cleaner van and you paint it hot pink, and that one van drives around New York City, you'll say, oh man, I've been seeing that van all over the place. So yeah, have you noticed that van? And it's just the same one van, but because it's so different from all the other vans that are out there, then it makes you feel like you've been seeing it and it's much more present. The thing that started to happen, and I don't know if it was just me, and I don't have the images here, but after this went live, there was the spring concert, or it was a spring concert, fall concert cover of Time Out New York magazine used Day Glow Pink in their typeface, and it said "Killin' Concerts." I mean, things like that. It's like, oh, I'm starting to see this everywhere. And then we got a little bit happy with it, and we did the same thing for their membership. So if that was about putting butts in the seats in all of their individual concerts over the course of the year, for their membership, instead of like similar to Girl Scouts where it was be a girl, here it was, if you love jazz, join Jazz Lincoln Center. We said, nope, let's not, we can't use that, that's boring, that's dusty. Let's make this a chant. Love, jazz, join. Love, jazz, join. And we printed that in, you can see there's a pattern here, but then we had this day glow orange to stand out. And so this was a little piece that when you went to the jazz club, you had silly Wynton Marsalis there kind of pointing at you. I made him do that. He still regrets it today. And seriously, he was like, Bobby, I can't believe you made me do that, man. God, I can't do that again, man. It ruined my reputation. But you know, we did it all in day glow inks. We made it feel fun and exciting. And it was just, for graphic designers especially, it was just something that we were able to get a little bit crazy with, but to make this chant. So when we started a movement, you know, whether it's you know, the movements that we see today with Black Lives Matter, or you know, a political revolution, maybe not quite at that scale, but for us, we needed to start a revolution to help a music that we thought was really special, a music that is alive and well, not just old and dusty, to stand out so that people would be a part of it. So, thank you. So we have time for any questions, or? Okay. So I'm happy to answer any other questions, any specific things, or go into more detail.
What was the catalyst for you to start your own firm?
What's interesting about, I believe, probably a lot of you all, is when you are now in this situation, you're super excited, ambitious, eager, and what ended up happening, I think the catalyst was going through this SVA program for me, because it made me think that I could do so much more with design than I had been doing. So yes, I learned type and scale and layout, but now I learned that I could use design to do that made me happy, and that was working with people that I loved what they were about, and also being able to see how I could use design to make a difference. So it started, the catalyst was being a student, mulling things over with Jennifer and others, and saying, you know what, I want to do this. Probably a lot of it too, to be honest, was after a while, I was like, I don't know if I could have somebody always telling me what to do. I want to do it this way. I want to do it my way. And like, you know, so there might have been a little bit of the, you know, authority issue, but I've never been happier. And so like we would talk about it a lot when we were in school, but then I said, okay, being a little bit OCD, being a little bit like crazy and methodical about these things, what do I need to do to make this happen? So yes, I could easily go from graduating into making it happen, but it probably wouldn't have lasted long, because I didn't know anything about running a business. And if people were going to hire me to do stuff that impacted their business, then what experience did I have other than being a student? So I then went and took on jobs that helped me to gain experience in doing those things. So first I worked at Ogilvy and Mather with one of my professors, Brian Collins, at a place called the Brand Integration Group, where we were able to do pretty exciting things, some of the type of things that we're doing and hoping to do at OCD. But do it for Coca-Cola, Hershey's. We developed the identity for New York City's Olympic bid. Went from there to Jazz at Lincoln Center, from there to Nokia, from there to then starting our company. So kind of one, learning how to deal with different clients and collaborate with strategists and other people, strategists and account managers and others in advertising. Then to leading and building a team and having to deal with the politics and selling things in, of working internally. Then going to Nokia, one of the things that I didn't mention, but one of the best parts about that is we were in a design office in the center of London in Soho, and my team was all graphic designers, but sitting across from me were some of the best product designers I'd ever seen and still stay in touch with, and can't wait till we can figure out what to collaborate on. Product designers, colors and material designers, like things I didn't even know they had designers for. And like the things that I learned from that Even working with design researchers that did a lot of the help with the testing of like, how do we craft the right questions? How do we make sure that the feedback that we're going to get is going to help us to iterate the product packaging rather than, and then from there it was like, okay, now the time is right. Luckily I had stumbled across a couple of relationships along the way, built a couple of relationships along the way that helped me to have some work, and then we just went from there and never looked back.
Hi. So first of all, thanks for coming. I'm super excited to see you here. I have a question. So you mentioned the white versus the pink van.
Yes.
What helps you build forms beyond the obvious?
Well, a lot of it has to do, what helps me and us do things beyond the obvious? Well, sometimes we do some things that are pretty obvious too, but there's a reason for that, because sometimes we'll start with something that people have a common understanding of. So we might start with something that's somewhat cliche, and then see what we can do about that cliche to make it different and new so that people actually recognize it and see it again. So that's one way. That's one thing. The other is, I think, relying on people and continuing to push each other. So we have to be comfortable asking questions. One of the things, and I encourage this in our classes, but we do this also in our process every day at the office, is instead of in our critiques asking, well, what do you think? Do you like it? Do you like this? What do you think about this? We try to not ask that question. Instead, we ask the question of, this is the work that we've just done. How do we make it better? And the reason we ask that question is because it's less about what do you think and whether you like it or not, because that, oftentimes you're not the target audience. And you also can bring some other things to the table which might not be quite relevant. But if I ask you the question of how do I make this better, and you think about how to do that in a way, the feedback is much more constructive. And it's, wow, well, have you considered this because of that, that, and that? Rather than, man, you know, I hated pink, it feels so feminine, and I don't know if anybody, I literally had somebody maybe a month or two ago, we were in this meeting for a hospital type of project, healthcare project. I'm wearing, I'm presenting basically to some big time people in the company. I'm wearing this pink shirt, a tie and a jacket, and we presented a couple of the concepts, and one was teetering on kind of a burgundy, but going more in a little bit more pinkish direction. And one of the people said, well, you know, I don't think the doctors are going to ever, you know, like pink. They would never wear pink. They would never. And I was sitting there with a pink shirt on. I was like, all right, cool. You know, like, and but instead of thinking of it that way, trying to say, well, what can we do to make this better? How do we get this to a certain point? And if we can do that, then we're constantly pushing ourselves to think beyond just the obvious.
Hi, thanks for coming. I have a sort of specific question about the Girl Scouts project. It's twofold. One, when they came to you, did they know that the Green Bloods were the target audience? And two, how hard was it to get them to like keep it pretty close to the original?
Those are two very good questions. So the first question, the short answer is no. So the first question being, did they know that the Green Bloods were their target audience? Well, the target audience actually varied. It's a pretty diverse audience. They have kind of some different segments within Girl Scouts themselves. So you have the people that have been part of Girl Scouts for a very, very long time. You also have some very important people that are part of the Girl Scouts that have only been part of the Girl Scout for maybe a year, maybe 2 years, maybe 3 years, and they are the girls. And so the first people that we spoke with were the girls. And the hard part is about, how do I go to, you know, an 8-year-old, a 10-year-old and say, well, what do you think about the Girl Scout logo? Here, tell me. You know, that's something that it was hard. And we said, no, we're not going to approach it like that at all. We basically, and this is pretty funny, we bought tons and tons of teen magazines and kid magazines, Nickelodeon type of stuff, and we bought a whole bunch of those types of things. Man, I tell you, I'm probably still on some type of watch list after going to like Barnes & Noble and buying all these teen and girl magazines, and they looked at me like I'm crazy. But we took all these and had these working sessions with the girls, and we'd ask them questions like, you know, what do friends, you know, what type of things are your friends up to, or I think the question was like, you know, when you're with your friends, what do you guys care about? What do you do? Things like that. We'd ask questions, and they cut it out, and we had them make these big collages, which we have, and that's another presentation for another time. But what we ended up doing, it's a bit of an iterative process. Not necessarily in the way that we normally would want, but we did this massive presentation to the board. And of course, on the board, you have some that are the ones that are helping to guide the business. You have those that are very vested in the work that we're doing and understand branding. You have those that are there because they have been part of the Girl Scouts for 30, 40, 50 years. We literally, I had a woman after the board meeting of our first presentation, she said, hey, it's funny that we're going through this because I was in the meetings when we did the first redesign. And that redesign was in 1978 when Saul Bass came in there and presented. And that blew my mind. And so we needed to, it was actually after that meeting that we realized that, okay, there's some people here that are going to be really upset if we change too much. And we didn't want to change too much either. We just wanted to give them more of a system. So that was one of the things that we kind of learned along the way. We had some sense of what it was going to be, but we had to tread carefully. Yeah, and the second question, did I get that one?
Yes, you
yep. Addressed it, yeah. Okay, so yeah, we didn't want to change it too much, and actually some people wanted to change more, and we had to be very careful about why and what changed, and to make sure that it retained some stuff. Because you could also argue the point of that there's not a lot of equity built because the target audience is 8, 9, 10 years old, and they don't have any equity. But what they would say is, oh, but my mom has that logo. My grandma has that logo. And say, oh, but see, we can't. So we need to be very careful about that.
So thank you for the talk. My question is, coincidentally, this morning I was looking at a side-by-side from the old Girl Scout logo and the new one. I didn't realize that you had worked on it. And I was wondering, like, it's just so nice because I was looking at it and wondering, why did they put bangs? And so that's my question to you. I would never get that chance in a million years, but here you are.
Well, for a handful of reasons. And I also have that in a more elaborate presentation, but I didn't want to put you all to sleep today. So the first thing that we learned is that this trefoil shape is hugely important. And if we use that trefoil shape, then the system can be much more robust, and it can speak to the girls, but it could also be something that could be received at the White House and taken seriously. Now, so if we give them this trefoil shape, the one that was originally done by in '78 was softened to the point where it just looked like a cloud if we didn't have anything in it. But the actual trefoil had this very strong kind of point at the bottom. So we redrew it to be a strong but distinctive mark that could be used with the faces and without. During the process of that, we realized that there was a reason why that shape was the way it was. So to have that rounded, softer bottom that was done originally is because if you put people in this thing and you have this weird point, then it's just awkward and strange visually. And so we had to start to do some very careful shifting around and redrawing to make sure things fit well within that shape. And in the process, there was a version where there was a longer kind of hairline, and it still looked a little bit old school. It still felt a little bit Charlie's Angel-esque. And there was another version that was explored that had this just subtle kind of cut in that line that worked as a bang. and it felt more contemporary. It also helped to signify that this was more than just one girl repeated. It helped to signify that it was many girls coming together. And it just, as a memorable, more timeless mark, it really hit that quality a little bit better for us. And so, and the distinctiveness of it, just, some of those things as well. So there were some storytelling cues that were really important, as well as just some simple kind of scale and kind of gestalt issues that we had to deal with. So, yeah.
Back here. In working with an established identity, there's a lot to draw from. In a lot of these examples, almost a century of resources. What's the difference in approach when you have to work with a comparatively very new identity, as opposed to someone who's got a lot of things rooted, like the trefoil or Blue Note from the Lincoln Center?
Well, what's interesting with Jazzy Lincoln Center is the identity itself was quite new, but it was leveraging some of those qualities that people were familiar with. And so when we had to actually build out that system, it still felt a little bit old school in a way that just didn't allow for it to stand out. And then I think there's two approaches to answering that question. One is if there's a fairly new brand that's coming to us and asking for work or help. Now, with that, like for instance, the Highline has been around for, the Highline was first started, Friends of the Highline, this organization was first started in 1999. And there was a logo developed for it then, and it's the H that has two crossbars because the Highline is built on a train track. And that was done by a friend of ours, Paula Scher from Pentagram. Now, over the course of them building the Highline, it became very, very well known. A lot of money and funding went into it, and it opened, I think it was in 2009. We were brought in 2010 or 11, based on the recommendation from Paula, to help to build out that system over time. So what we didn't do and what we didn't want to do is go in and say, oh, this logo, it's so hard to work with, this typeface is bad, and why are you using these colors? What we did instead is we said, okay, here's the elements that people have become familiar with really quickly. It's been around for, let's say, for people, for New Yorkers, it's been around for maybe a year. I think it was the second year when we came in. And they were just starting to get things established. So what we did is we built out a more robust identity by starting to apply that over and over to all of their different things. So we designed flyers and signage and invitations and magazines and calendars and merchandise. And along the way, we learned so much more about what works and what doesn't work in this system. So we learned how to use the H, big and strong. We learned that when you use photography at the Highline, use it big and full bleed because the Highline is just so beautiful and the photography that they're able to get was great. So instead of trying to think about what changes, what we wanted to do is figure out how we work within a limited tool set and start to use that as much as possible. And it's almost like drinking wine or a good beer. If you I'll say wine. Let's say with wine. So if you like wine and you drink Pinot Noir over and over and over again, you start to notice the differences between a Pinot from Oregon versus a Pinot from France, right? And if you start to know that because you drink so much Pinot Noir that you can understand the differences. And so when people see the Highline materials, they see the Highline as a whole, but we've been able to build it out in a way that we start to understand all of the nuances and differences. And so we were able to kind of learn how to use the typeface by using it over and over and over again. We learned like it could be big or it could be small. Couldn't be small, but it could be be bigger. We learned a lot of things about it. And having to work within those restrictions rather than the easy way out, which is just finding new faces, using new colors, doing things differently, actually helped that brand to be stronger, and I think it helped us team-wise to understand how to implement brands in a better way. So that's one way of doing it. The other answer to that question, which I'll be shorter with, is when people come to us with a new idea and we need to start from scratch. And that goes through a bit more of a kind of the typical ideation and concepting process. And then we just have to start making things, but we don't make things based on kind of how we feel about stuff. We make it based on the things that we've discovered in our research. Okay.
Thank you so much for your great talk. My question is about the New York Times that you talked about. You talked about the diversity, and I know they have like a huge gender diversity problem in terms of like their authors and people who comment under like articles on their website. Can you elaborate more on that? Like, where did that come from? Is it?
Well, I think when we mention diversity here, I think, yes, I think there's a lot of companies out there that have diversity issues within the makeup of the company, within the payment, salary payment, and you know, as graphic designers, brand designers, it's not something that we normally have that much of an impact on. However, with the New York Times, there's a couple of things that I just from my experience that I can say. One is, I think the diversity of the topics that they have and that they talk about is quite rich. We've shown here the New York Times Magazine, but we have been working with them on a lot of different products, whether it's the NYTVR, which is their virtual reality collaboration with Google Cardboard that's around and out now, whether it is providing content to different groups, so NYT Now, which is their app-based content, well, it's their app, versus those that reach people that are a little bit more higher end. So I think there's a lot of different ways that they reach their audience, and there's a lot of different ways that they are creating content. But as far as my experience, I think my experience with the New York Times has been pretty fantastic. I think Jill Abrams was the executive editor, the man leading the New York Times a couple of years ago. Now that role is taken by an African-American man. My original connection with the New York Times was through Rem Duplessis, who's one of the most brilliant art directors and creative directors there is. He's now at Apple. He's a friend of mine, African-American. The people that we work with daily at the New York Times now, whether it's leading the marketing and creative direction team, they're women. Gail Bickler, who is now in Rem's role. So my experience with the New York Times has been fantastic. I mean, really, really good. And I feel like we are very much collaborators, and I'm actually pretty inspired by the diversity. I think overall, things can be much, much better in a lot of different places, but I'm not sure the New York Times are the ones to use as that example.
I have a bit of a silly question. So the second years, we just had a brand product and experience class, and we had built a lot of brand pyramids, and one of the suggestions that our teachers had made was, in thinking about our brand, think about a celebrity that you might connect with. A celebrity? So if you had to choose a celebrity that you believe OCD, that might represent OCD, who would it be?
If I had to choose a celebrity, it would be Jennifer Kynan. That's interesting. I think you know, what's interesting about OCD is Jennifer and I founded it, and in the process we learned, and we kind of knew this going in, that we're actually quite different. So the things that she's really good at, I'm probably less good at. Her kind of personality is a little bit different than mine, and so we're bringing a good mix and richness to the company. So I think that there's probably a few different, I don't know, I guess that one's a bit more I'd have to think about. I have to first think about celebrities and things, but that's a hard one. Who's celebrity?
What if two celebrities had a child? Two celebrities.
Well, because I think that there is a little bit of a variation between the two. I love I think the work that Shonda Rhimes is doing. She's a celebrity. I think she's smart and pretty outspoken and pretty groundbreaking in the way that she's approaching things. You know, I think when you think about celebrity and couples, I think about you know, President Obama, and I think you know, with that, I think that there's a little bit of, especially now because we're in the season for it. You know, what was interesting about Obama is very much about a vision and an aspiration, and I think we're pretty ambitious, and a lot of times we're bumping up against walls and ceilings and hopefully breaking through them. The thing that is happening now is Jennifer's not here because she is serving as the design director for Hillary Clinton. So she actually works for Hillary right this second. And so with that said, I think that there's a lot of things that from a kind of standpoint of being very good and capable that I think Jennifer also embodies. So I think that it's probably a pretty broad answer to a pretty difficult question, but I definitely like actually both of those, of Obama and Clinton together. But.
I'm going to ask this question then. So I saw recently a presentation, it was an interview online with Michael Beirut, who designed the Hillary logo. And he showed it as a system with lots of different permutations and imagery in it. But I've never seen one. And I'm wondering if that was killed because of the imagery that people were going to make that was not sympathetic to Hillary. Because it seemed like such a brilliant idea. Never once did I see any perm other than like the blue being the red being the blue, the white being the red. But in terms of adding images into the H and the arrow. And I was kind of heartbroken. It just seemed so wonderful and obvious. And I was just like, oh, that's why they're not doing it.
Well, I think actually if you hit the right hashtags, there's a lot of it out there. I think it's also because what I've learned about my kind of peripheral involvement is there are some states that are much more in it than I think even New York is at this point because of just the schedule. Now, I've seen pictures. For instance, they have a Flickr page, and you could see some of the pretty amazing stuff that people are making. I've seen these two ladies, I think it was in South Carolina, that made these three-dimensional H's with like blinking lights, and they're wearing them like Flavor Flav clocks. I mean, it's just pretty amazing. And Hillary is, the campaign is making those as well. So they had an event in Brooklyn, I think it was in Brooklyn, a couple of weeks ago. It was a high-end event, so I wasn't there, but I saw pictures. But you know, where images of Hillary were in the H or New York City. Yeah, and it happens more. And there actually has been a lot of, but there's been a lot of illustrations and things like that have also been done. So it's been, I think they've been carefully crafted and put out there so that those in different areas can feel like, and so at the events when you see the pictures, there's actually a decent amount of it.
Again, I don't think you can be careful about it.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I think is, that's what I wonder is what's happening. You can't control it.
No, and that's that. I think there's I think the campaign does make a lot of materials, and when they talk about system from their point of view, a lot of it is around the message. So there's a lot of the message itself, but it's also kind of looking at things that either Hillary has said or friends of, and even kind of in opposition. So there's a lot more around that. And I think you'll see, whether through social media or other places, that those messages are typically pretty wordy. And so I think there's also a balance of what the campaign is sharing versus and what they need to say. So for instance, if you get out to vote, it's like, you know, or what is a caucus? How do I caucus? So it's very much informational and tactical. And so I think that sometimes there's going to be places where kind of the brand and the H and other things like that stand out. And right now, especially when it's like knocking on doors, getting people to the events, I think it's a bit more informational. But we might see more of that soon.
I mean, am I the only person, but did anyone know that this was a system to fill the H and the arrow in with other things, other images, colors?
I had heard controversy about it because the arrow points to the right.
That's all I ever read though, too.
Yeah.
But again, to me, it wasn't introduced as a system at all. It was a logo.
Right. And I think that, and that's the big, a lot of what Michael Beirut has done is the logo, which is, as I've shown with other stuff here, one of the key components to when you want to know what something is, you say, oh, there it is, it's the logo. And what Jennifer's been doing now for eight months is building out the system. And a lot of times the logo is a part of it, but it's much more. There's a lot of other stuff. But there's some. I think if you go, I think they do a great job on Twitter, and you can see a lot of the messaging and the system and the color. They're broken out of just using blue and red. They do a lot of things with type and message and images. So, and I think it's just continuing to build. So, yeah.
Can I ask you a question about the business?
Yes.
You're how many employees now?
It's around between 6 and 8, depending on the day.
Yeah, so you're right on the verge of like not being able to do design anymore, right? And managing and doing sales and legal and just all of that. So can you talk to the students a little bit about like this moment in your career? Because this is a key moment. Like you're going to grow and do less design, or you're going to stay where you are and have a lot of hand in it.
Yep.
As the conventional wisdom goes, and certainly, many of the people that I've met.
Well, it's a very good question, because when we started, it was 2 people sitting in a room, and we were making everything, responding to every email, running out to every meeting, building and giving every presentation. And from there, we then brought on interns to see what it's like to have a different person in the room. And then we said, okay, we'll hire. And so we hired somebody, and it scared the heck out of us to have to, like, they're relying on us. But then it actually, once we did it, kind of like a lot of other things, you're like, okay, this isn't as hard as I thought. And then we hired 2 people. And there's times when it does get a little bit crazy and challenging, but that's also what makes it so exciting. So these are the things that I've learned. As we continue to grow, I'm less involved in the day-to-day design work. However, having a vision for where you want things to go, or the confidence to be able to coach and guide the team to get things to where they need to be, is hugely important. So design-wise, I'm probably now around 15 to 20%, and that can be more or less depending on the day. But for instance, yesterday I had to run out to a meeting, not run out, I mean, we knew it was happening. We had to rent a car and drive to New Jersey for a meeting in New Jersey. And while we're at that meeting, the person in the meeting was asking for some revisions to the presentation that we had given them the day before. And so, how do we get that done? We could say, sorry, we can't get it done. You don't want to have to wait. And it's a thing where that can become a problem. Or we could say, you know what? We're working on that. Thanks for sending over that feedback today. You'll have it by the end of the meeting. And that confidence in us helps us to build, that confidence that the client can then have in us that we're just going to get it done. Goes a long way. It helped us to build trust and continue to get more and more work from them, which helps us then be able to pay the bills and all of that. But at the same time, like these are the clients, like these types of clients, they're not small clients. And so they can easily go to a massive company and they can have tons and tons of people on it. But they're trusting us for maybe the way we're approaching things, for the way that we work with them, and for our kind of being able to deliver. So now I actually am very excited about talking about the work that we're doing, about kind of giving you the insight and the background to how we're approaching things, to figuring out what do we do on social media, what do we share, and also I get much more involved in, yes, we had to find a legal team, and man, they're expensive. Or we have, what do we do with hiring and firing and things like that. So it's a maturity that we've had to quickly grow into, and it's something that at first you might not be comfortable with it, and then we have to learn to be comfortable with being uncomfortable and continue to push. I don't know how big we'll get. I don't know how big we actually want to be. Sometimes I wish we were twice as big, and other times I just wish it was 2 people in a room. And that can change almost depending on the day. One thing I do know is that it's work and it's hard. Working with clients, working with people, working with companies, no matter what, it's work. They're paying us because it's not easy and they expect us to figure it out. And I have some incredible stories because of it. I have some really fun work because of it. And I think it's definitely what I want to continue to do and just learn more from. So, and I think the one other fun part that is one of those things that not too many people get until you're in the situation. But when I was working at Jazzy Lincoln Center, I was living uptown in Harlem, and I would come down on the A. I'd go to work, and I'd go back on the A. When I was working at some other place, I would come down, go to work, and come back. But now I go to the office, which are in the East Village, and then I'll have a meeting down in the financial district, and I come back, and then I have a meeting up in Midtown, and then I come back, and tomorrow we have to rent a zip car so we can drive to New Jersey. I've never seen so much of New York City and traveled all over the country and even the world because of what we do. And that to me is one of the big payoffs. So I thoroughly enjoy that. There's always some ups and downs, but that's what makes it exciting, and we learn from it and grow from it. So, thanks, cool, thank you.